Okay, welcome to the third webinar. Was anybody able to have any discussions last week about systems change in their communities? And how did it go if you did? Okay, I'm assuming from the silence, nobody did. Okay, again, we encourage you to start this process sooner rather than later because the deadline is January 23rd of 2018. So one thing I wanted to say before I delve into meeting 3 materials, I had the pleasure of speaking with representatives from Corpus Christi this week. They were at our summit and they asked me, if you can't meet weekly, what can you do? And so my recommendation is, and I think I mentioned this during the first webinar, but the toolkit is intended to be entirely flexible. We built it out over the course of 8 weeks because we felt that 1-hour meetings every week for 8 weeks would be more manageable than asking people to potentially take off 2 days to do something like an action camp, which you can entirely do with these materials. However, that is up for every community to decide. So while it's laid out in an 8-week series, you can take out all the meeting materials and conduct an action camp, which is what Built for Zero and Zero to 2016 does with communities. So I encourage you to take what we provided to you and take the intended lessons from each of the meetings and apply them as you guys see fit in your communities. Again, you guys are the local experts. We won't be as well versed in your communities as you guys are, and so we encourage you to determine what is best for you and the capacity of people that you work with. Any questions about anything before I dive into meeting number 3? Okay. You have to just select an arbitrary amount of time before you make the call. So meeting number 3. So in meeting 1, we talked about the rules of the meetings, what we need attendees to do, right? They need to do the homework. They need to come to the meetings ready to be engaged. In meeting 2, we talked about what it means to end homelessness, why ending homelessness is entirely possible. We've seen it happen in 38, I think, or 30-something communities in a few states now. It is entirely possible for your community to end homelessness. Now what we're going to do is we're going to talk about a housing crisis response system and how you retool your current crisis response system to be much more streamlined and thoughtful in your application of helping people who are experiencing a housing crisis. So in this meeting, you are going, hopefully my internet loads today. Awesome. Okay. So in meeting number 2, a lot of the prep materials for meeting 3 focused on housing crisis response system. It includes a reading from Opening Doors, which is the federal strategic plan to prevent and end homelessness. And I believe objective 10 is to retool housing crisis response systems. So it provides some background material. Again, part of the responsibilities of attendees is that they're reading this material. If you're doing a 2-day action camp, you're going to have to spend some time educating the attendees about what this means, because obviously they won't have the time to read these materials if you're doing it over the course of 2 days, unless you send out pre-homework. So what you're going to do during this session is you're going to review the meeting materials, which will also, if anybody remembers from school, will give you a really good idea of who's not doing the reading. So it's happened to me before in that nobody has done the reading, and you really need to scratch your plan and fly by the seat of your pants and do that education in that session. That's, again, facilitation is an art, and you just need to roll with the punches, which is why I box. It's good prep. So you're going to review the meeting materials and have a discussion about what a housing crisis response system is. you're going to ask people, right, for how many of you is this a new concept? In a lot of communities, sorry, I keep doing this, but my glasses keep falling. In a lot of your communities, you've heard me talk about housing crisis response system, or if people attend our COC general meetings, we talk about housing crisis response system. We, as a COC, have been a broken record on this for several years. So it will be interesting to see who has never heard this concept before, because it will give everybody an idea, or it will give the facilitators an idea of how they need to package the material. I really encourage you to ask people to describe what a housing crisis response system is in their own words. We've seen with adult learners that if they can learn materials and then teach other people, they retain that information better than if they're just reading the materials or it's just being taught at them. So you may have noticed you may have noticed and with the meetings previously, but also in future meetings, that we're really trying to set up a time for you guys to have a discussion. So this is something else that I told Corpus this week, is you need to create a space for people to have a discussion. It's okay if people disagree even after having a discussion. Everybody has their own values. Everybody has their own conceptions of how things are, but the important thing is that you're trying to educate people on concepts, because I think a lot of the hesitancy about implementing certain things is due to a misunderstanding of what it truly means. And we see that a lot with Housing First. I have experienced it a lot in that people think Housing First means housing only. It does not. And so I've had instances where I've talked to people about Housing First and they've come full circle. It's not going to happen with everybody. That's just reality, right? But you have to at least try. Right, there are discussions, questions in the facilitator agenda. You can add additional ones. It's really intended, and this is where like the finesse of case management and stuff comes in. Like asking open-ended questions is really critical to this process. So I have put possible discussion questions to get you started, but in order to facilitate a really robust dialogue, you need to continue asking questions. You need to probe people further if they disagree, if they agree, and you need to get people talking to each other. It's about spending the time to do that. It's about developing relationships. So how would you define our system in this way? Why or why not? A housing crisis response system would require system-wide program integration. What does that mean to you? There is a handout, which is the housing crisis response system definition. You hand this out, you have people read it. A note that I have in here is that the definition of ending homelessness, which was a handout that you passed out last week, or whenever you pass it out, but if you meet what the BOS is asking you to do last week, the definition for ending homelessness is very much the definition of a housing crisis response system. And the definition of a housing crisis response system is the definition for ending homelessness, because these are the things that we've seen across the country that are effective in preventing and ending homelessness. So you can bring that up, right? Hopefully people will have those materials with them. You can read that handout again. You can talk about how the two definitions are different. So this definition, for example, is a little bit more robust. For example, it includes a crisis response system considers all of the competing crisis needs and the sum of resources available to meet them, and saves its most expensive resources for those who cannot be successfully assisted without them. So the other definition doesn't necessarily use those words. So I encourage you to use these two definitions to also engage in discussion about the different ways that you can define what a housing crisis response system, and ultimately what are those characteristics that are similar among all of those definitions, because there are similarities among all of them. Another thing you may want to point out is that just like with coordinated entry, which when it was passed, it was coordinated intake and assessment, then it became coordinated assessment, now it's coordinated entry, there's also coordinated access across the country. There's different names for it. So there's some communities that call it a homeless crisis response system. We call it a housing crisis response system. It's all meaning the same thing, in that all of your providers are very they work in collaboration, they work in coordination to expend their resources in the best way possible. So next, what you're going to do is there is an activity. So this is based, we kind of did this actually when I went to Cameron County for the first time, where we put up these like big Post-its, and we put the intervention type, and they put different Post-its for who provided that service. So it's very much based off of that model, but it takes it a step further. So there are instructions. Excuse me. So the first step to that is handing out the components of a housing crisis response system. So we have seen there are components to a housing crisis response system that ensure that your system is successful. And so this includes coordinated entry. It includes engagement programs such as street outreach, homelessness prevention and diversion, temporary housing such as emergency shelter, transitional housing, bridge housing, permanent housing such as rapid rehousing, permanent supportive housing, and then community-based permanent housing, which is just subsidized or unsubsidized housing. So what I rent is community-based permanent housing. And then there's supportive services, because supportive services are also critical to this piece, right? We get people into housing, but the next most important step, or another important step, is providing support services for them to maintain that housing, right? So we want to connect them with housing, and we want to help them maintain that housing. So housing stability is really, really critical, and connecting people to those resources is critical in the success of housing stability. So you'll share this. This is just basic information about what each of those interventions mean. And then you'll go into the activity. So the way we set it up is you can do it one of two ways. So you can have this Post-it, the big Post-it with a poster with other small Post-its, or you can do it on a dry erase board. I don't have it here. Or you can do it on a dry erase board and put the different interventions. So we put photos in here for you to see examples of that. So what you're going to do is you're going to allow for 10 to 15 minutes, right? You're going to have your different Post-its with emergency shelter, and you're going to hand out Post-its to attendees, and then attendees will go around the room putting up, in some communities it may be one, in other communities there may be several, so they'll be putting up the different projects in your community with the name. And you'll do this for all the different component types of a housing crisis response system. So you'll have one for emergency shelter, one for rapid rehousing, one for street outreach, all those. And so the intention of this activity is to, right, we have our housing crisis response system, is to indicate what interventions or what projects are those component types in the community. So the intention is at the end of this activity, it will give you, one, a very clear idea of what are your gaps in the community when it comes to like component type. But afterwards, and we'll talk about this in a little bit, you'll be sending this information to me in addition to the data that you gathered the previous meeting, and I'll be working with you guys to identify the gaps based on your data. So after you allow 10 to 15 minutes to do the activity, your facilitator is going to go through and then ask very structured questions about each project. So who, agency A, they're an emergency shelter, so who do they serve? Hopefully what you guys notice is that a lot of the terms that we're using is very similar to the HIC, the housing inventory chart, which is done every year. So the housing inventory chart, I know you hear from us every year, it sounds like a total pain to have to give us this information. The value of the housing inventory chart is, one, at a BOS level, it helps us see where our gaps are in different areas of the BOS, But in a local level, if you do robust analysis, pairing it with your HMIS data and your PID data, you can have a really good idea of what average utilization at your projects are. So for example, we do have some emergency shelters that have very low utilization. From our perspective, the community should be having conversations about, one, why the utilization rate is so low, but what could be done with the other beds instead of emergency shelter, or could money be funneled somewhere else to provide permanent housing? And those are hard conversations. Those are really hard conversations to have. So I just want to manage that expectation and make that very clear. The other thing that you can see from doing this and from analyzing your HIC is if you have a gap in services that serve certain subpopulations. So for example, in the balance of state, the majority of our emergency shelters are domestic violence providers. It's not a bad thing. That's the reality of our system. However, we have a lack of emergency shelter that serves single individuals, for example. So it's really important to look at your data to all types of data that's being gathered, to have an idea about what your system is structured like and what the realities of your system are like. Because if you keep your, like the monkey, if they don't see anything, you're going to be, ignorance is bliss until you realize it's a really severe problem. So what you're going to go through and do is say, so who do you serve, right? So we'll say emergency shelter A serves single males, single females, and then households with children. So I'm going to put single males, single females, households with children, and then I'm going to ask them how many units they have or how many beds they have in the case of emergency shelters, because usually emergency shelters don't have rooms. So a unit is a room, a bed is a bed in a unit usually. So for a lot of emergency shelters, it's one unit because it's congregate, and then you may have 95 beds inside of it. So you're going to indicate the unit and the beds. And then what we also want to know is, are any of those beds dedicated to a certain subpopulation? So veterans, youth, or chronically homeless. What we mean by dedicated is that you receive funding from whatever source it may be to reserve that bed for somebody who meets the certain criteria. Does that make sense? So another reason why we want this to look like the HIC is we want to get you guys applying this at different times of the year, not just when the HIC is coming up, and so that you guys get more, so you guys are using the same language more often. So does the description of what a dedicated bed mean, so does the description of what a dedicated bed is make sense to everybody? Yeah, okay. So our emergency shelter, we get a grant from TVC, yeah, Texas Veterans Commission, TVC. And through our grant, we have to reserve 15 beds for veterans. So I'm going to indicate 15 vets. So this will give us a good idea of, one, the size of your shelter, who your shelter serves, and then also whether or not any of your beds are dedicated for a certain subpopulation. The value of this is that if, for example, in your community, for your local prioritization, you're going to decide that for rapid rehousing that is not ESG or COC funded, we are going to target veterans. You will be able to know that at agency A, I have a bed for a veteran available, so if I can't identify somewhere else for them to go tonight, I know I can contact agency A to get them in. So this is all of this data gathering is about, one, being transparent. That's one thing we're working really hard on. And then two is getting a more holistic picture about what's going on in our community. So ultimately, data doesn't lie. It'll lie if you omit information. It'll lie if you put too much information in. So this is why we really want to work on this process throughout the year. Then what you're going to do, if you want, or I would hope most of you would do it, is you can take your phone and then you can take a photo of all your different stickies, and then you'll email them to me along with the data from the week prior. I'll probably ask a lot of questions, so you want to get this information into me as quick as possible. I'm going to prioritize people according to that prioritization that I talked about at the general meeting, I think 2 months ago. So communities that receive COC and ESG funding. Okay, I'm going to ask your question or answer your question in a second, Dakota. But communities that receive COC and ESG funding, they get prioritization over everybody else. Then it goes communities that receive COC funding, then communities that receive ESG state funding, and then communities that receive ESG city-county funding. So you're going to send the information to me, and I'll work on the data analysis for you guys and try as much as possible to paint a picture of what your system looks like and what gaps are being indicated by your data. And that's really it. The nice thing is everybody gets a break from homework this week. Don't forget to remind them about the qualitative assessment tools when they're due. Okay, any questions about that before I answer Dakota's question? Pretty straightforward. Coordinated entry is going to come later in the process. So this, again, the toolkit is not how to set up your CE system. The toolkit is how to have those overarching discussions about what needs to change in your community. So later on in this process, I will be sharing the CE written standards, and we'll be talking about that, because what you'll find in a lot of communities is that one of the biggest things you need to change is the lack of coordinated entry. So you need to implement that. So that is going to happen later on in this process. I'm more than happy to talk to you about it offline, but I just don't want to get people confused. What she brings up is that our Homeless Coalition meets once a month, and she doesn't know if they could get additional time, so she's suggesting potentially looking at the first 4 meeting materials at their next meeting, which is on the 17th. I think that's a great idea. You need to work with what you have, right? And the conversation ultimately needs to be had at some point. So what you're going to do, Holly, is at the end of this activity, you're going to take a picture of all the different interventions with the information, and then you're also going to attach the data and your problem statement from the week prior, and you're going to send that to me so that we can look at stuff. I'll probably have questions during the week. I'll look at your PIT information, which I have on this end, and potentially also pull an AHAR report to have an idea of what's going on in your community. But that's what you'll send to me, and I'll help with that. Again, that's our intention with this process, is that I help more in that like data analysis or thought thinking capacity than with the actual implementation of the systems within your community. Great question.